Welcome, beautiful souls, to Her True Stories, the channel where we dive deep into the raw, powerful stories of women who defied the odds, found their strength, and delivered a dose of unforgettable justice. Today, we're talking about a betrayal so profound, it struck at the very core of trust and family. Imagine standing proudly at your son's graduation, a moment of pure joy, only for your husband to publicly declare he's leaving you for another woman who sits there, smiling. But what if that public humiliation, that searing pain, was the very spark that ignited a quiet storm? A storm fueled by a lifetime of careful observation and a hidden dossier, leading to a reckoning no one saw coming. Get ready, because this is a journey of triumph you won't want to miss. My name is Patricia Peterson, and at 58 years old, I thought I understood the boundaries of human cruelty. I was wrong. The University of Chicago's graduation ceremony had been everything I dreamed of for my son Michael. The May sunshine filtered through the Gothic windows of Rockefeller Chapel as hundreds of proud families filled the ancient stone halls. I sat in the third row, my heart swelling with pride as Michael walked across that stage to receive his MBA. 30 years of marriage, countless sacrifices, and endless support had led to this moment. Richard sat beside me, impeccably dressed as always in his navy suit and Italian leather shoes. To anyone watching, we looked like the perfect couple, successful, established, celebrating our son's achievement together. I had spent the morning carefully choosing my outfit, a cream-colored dress that complemented my silver hair, which I'd grown out gracefully over the past few years. At 58, I felt confident in my skin, proud of the life we'd built together. After the ceremony, we gathered at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse downtown for the celebratory lunch I had planned weeks in advance. Michael beamed as he showed off his diploma to the assembled group, Richard's business associates, some family friends, and a few people I didn't immediately recognize. The wine flowed freely, and laughter filled our private dining room. That's when my 30-year marriage ended. Richard stood up, tapping his champagne flute with his knife to get everyone's attention. I assumed he was about to toast Michael, perhaps share one of those touching father-son moments that make graduation days so special. Instead, he cleared his throat and smiled in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. "Before we toast Michael's wonderful achievement," Richard began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "I have an announcement of my own to make." He wasn't looking at Michael. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on a woman I'd noticed earlier but hadn't thought much about, an attractive brunette in her early 40s, sitting with his business associates. She was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that money can buy, and as I watched, a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. "I've decided to file for divorce," Richard continued, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "I'm starting a new life, and I want everyone here to know that Veronica will be a part of that life." The woman, Veronica, raised her champagne glass slightly, that triumphant smile never leaving her face. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting for my reaction. My son's face had gone white with shock and embarrassment. Several people at the table looked genuinely horrified at Richard's timing and cruelty. But I had been expecting this moment for months. Not the public announcement. That was a cruelty beyond anything I had imagined Richard capable of. But the divorce itself? The affair? The lies and deception? I had known for almost a year. I took a slow sip of my champagne, set the glass down with steady hands, and looked directly at my husband of 30 years. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Richard," I said, my voice clear and calm. "It's refreshing to see you be honest for once." Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. Richard's name was written across the front in my careful handwriting. I had been carrying it for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. "I have something for you too," I said, extending the envelope toward him. Richard's confident smile faltered as he took the envelope. His hands, I noticed with satisfaction, trembled slightly as he broke the seal. As his eyes scanned the first page, all color drained from his face. He looked up at me, then at Veronica, then back at the documents in his hands. The triumphant smile disappeared from Veronica's face as she watched Richard's reaction. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the photographs, the police reports, the court documents, and the detailed timeline I had compiled over the past 6 months. Everything there was to know about Veronica Hayes, if that was even her real name. "Enjoy your new life," I said quietly, standing up from the table. "I think you'll find it quite educational." I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, leaving behind 30 years of marriage and a son who would eventually understand why his mother had chosen that moment to reveal the truth about his father's new beginning. The envelope I handed Richard contained the result of 6 months of meticulous investigation by the best private detective money could buy. What I had discovered about Veronica Hayes would have made a fascinating crime novel if it hadn't been so devastatingly real. Her real name was Victoria Delacroix, and she was a professional. Not in the way she presented herself to Richard and his social circle, but in the oldest profession of all, the art of the long con. The dossier began with her most recent identity theft conviction in Nevada, where she had bilked a retired casino owner out of $2.3 million before disappearing into the night. Before that, she had been Margaret Stevens in Dallas, where she convinced an oil executive to invest his retirement savings in a non-existent wellness retreat. In Phoenix, she was Elena Rodriguez, and she nearly destroyed a real estate developer before his children intervened. But it was the photographs that truly captured the scope of her operation. Victoria had a talent for reinvention that would have impressed Hollywood. Different hair colors, different styles, different personalities to match each mark. She studied her targets carefully, becoming exactly what they needed her to be. With Richard, she had become Veronica Hayes, art consultant and cultural sophisticate. She spoke knowledgeably about wine, quoted classical literature, and had opinions on everything from the Chicago Symphony to the best restaurants in Paris. Richard, going through what I now recognize as a textbook midlife crisis, had been completely captivated. The private investigator had also uncovered her modus operandi. Victoria typically spent 8 to 12 months infiltrating her target's life, gathering financial information, and positioning herself as indispensable. Then came the requests for temporary financial help, the joint investments, the gradual transfer of assets. By the time her marks realized what was happening, she was gone. But the most damning evidence in that envelope was the proof that Richard wasn't her first married target. In Sacramento, she had convinced a city councilman to leave his wife and children for her. The divorce had been finalized, the assets split, and Victoria had gained access to half of everything he owned. 3 weeks after the divorce was final, she disappeared with $800,000 in cash and securities. Richard had given her power of attorney over several of his business accounts. He had already transferred $400,000 to her investment portfolio. He had signed preliminary paperwork to add her name to 2 of his commercial properties. In other words, my husband wasn't just leaving me for a younger woman. He was being systematically robbed by a professional criminal who had played this exact same game at least 6 times before. The private investigator had also discovered something that Richard didn't know. Victoria had already been to see a lawyer about his assets and had been asking very specific questions about Illinois divorce law and community property rights. Richard was about to become victim number 7. My suspicions about Richard's affair had begun almost a year before that graduation lunch, though the signs had been subtle at first. 30 years of marriage teaches you to read your spouse's moods and habits, and Richard had been changing in ways that went beyond a simple midlife crisis. It started with his sudden interest in culture. Richard had always been a practical man, focused on business and sports. Then suddenly, he was attending art gallery openings, subscribing to opera seasons, and dropping the names of restaurants I'd never heard of. When I suggested we go together, he always had excuses: business dinners, client entertainment, networking events. Then came the clothes. Richard had always dressed well, but conservatively. Suddenly his wardrobe included silk scarves, expensive cologne, and shoes that cost more than most people's rent. He started going to a different barber, one who charged 10 times what his old guy had charged. The phone calls were the final clue. Richard had always been attached to his phone for business, but these calls were different. He would step outside to answer, or move to another room, speaking in low, intimate tones that I recognized from our early courtship days. But it was the credit card statements that forced me to face the truth. Dinners for two at expensive restaurants on nights when Richard claimed to be working late. Hotel charges in downtown Chicago when we lived 20 minutes away. Jewelry purchases that never appeared in my jewelry box. Charges at lingerie stores for items that definitely weren't my size. Some wives might have confronted their husbands immediately. Others might have chosen denial. But I am Patricia Peterson, and I believe in being thoroughly prepared before entering any battle. I hired James Crawford of Crawford Investigations on a gray February morning, 6 months before Michael's graduation. James came highly recommended by my divorce attorney friend Sarah Chin, who had used his services in several high-profile cases. "I don't want drama," I told James during our first meeting in his downtown office. "I want facts. I want documentation. I want to know exactly who my husband is involved with and exactly what I'm dealing with." James was a former FBI agent with 25 years of experience in white-collar crime. He was thorough, discreet, and expensive. He was also worth every penny. Within 2 weeks, he had identified Veronica Hayes and begun the deep background check that would eventually reveal her true identity. Within a month, he had photographic evidence of the affair and a preliminary financial analysis showing the money Richard had already transferred to her. But it was James's criminal background investigation that truly opened my eyes to what we were dealing with. "Mrs. Peterson," he said during our third meeting, sliding a thick folder across his desk, "your husband isn't just having an affair. He's being systematically defrauded by a professional criminal." The folder contained everything that would eventually go into the envelope I handed Richard that day. Police reports from 6 different states. Court records detailing her convictions. Victim statements from previous marks. Financial records showing the scope of her operations. "She's good at what she does," James continued. "Very good. She creates complete false identities, establishes credible backgrounds, and infiltrates her targets' lives slowly and carefully. Your husband is following the exact same pattern as her previous victims." "What's the timeline?" I asked. Based on her previous operations, I'd estimate she's planning to complete this phase within the next 6 months. She'll push for marriage, consolidate access to his assets, and then disappear. The fact that he's already talking about divorce tells me she's accelerating the timeline. That's when I made my decision. "I want everything you can find on her," I said. "Every identity, every crime, every victim. I want a complete dossier that will expose exactly what she is." "What are you planning to do with it?" I smiled. "I'm going to let Richard discover the truth about his new life in the most educational way possible." The graduation lunch was on a Saturday. By Monday morning, the whispers had already started. Richard's dramatic announcement had been witnessed by 15 people, including several prominent members of Chicago's business community. Word of his public humiliation of his wife, combined with the mystery of that envelope and my calm, cryptic response, had spread through their social circles like wildfire. I didn't need to do anything to fuel the gossip. Richard had provided all the entertainment himself. But I also wasn't passive. Over the following weeks, I had strategic conversations with key people in our social circle. I never made direct accusations about Veronica. I simply asked innocent questions that planted seeds of doubt. Have you known Veronica long? I would ask Richard's golf partners. Richard mentioned she's an art consultant, but I can't seem to find her gallery listed anywhere. I tried to look up some of her previous work online. I mentioned the Wives of the Country Club. It's strange. There's almost no digital footprint for someone who's supposed to be so established in the art world. To Richard's business associates, I expressed concerns about his judgment. I hope he's being careful. I would say with just the right amount of worry. 30 years of marriage teaches you to recognize when someone isn't being completely honest. I just hope he's protecting himself financially. The beauty of this approach was that I never had to lie or even stretch the truth. I was simply a concerned soon-to-be ex-wife asking reasonable questions about a woman who had suddenly appeared in their social circle. Meanwhile, Richard was dealing with his own problems. The contents of that envelope had clearly shaken him, but he was trapped in a corner of his own making. Having publicly announced his new relationship and his intention to divorce me, he couldn't easily backtrack without looking like a fool. I watched from a distance as he tried to verify the information in the dossier. He hired his own private investigator, who quickly confirmed everything James had discovered. He confronted Veronica with the evidence, which led to their first major fight in public at the Union League Club. According to several witnesses, Veronica had initially denied everything, then claimed the evidence was fabricated, then finally broke down crying and begged Richard to believe that she had changed, that her past was behind her, that their love could overcome anything. Richard, being a man desperate to believe his fantasy was real, chose to accept her explanations. But the damage was done. The whispers had become conversations, and the conversations had become genuine concern among Richard's friends and business associates. His law partners began asking pointed questions about his financial decisions. His golf buddies started declining invitations to double date with him and Veronica. The country club, where we had been members for 15 years, quietly made it known that Veronica's membership application was under review. Most importantly, his clients began expressing concerns about his judgment and stability. By August, 3 months after the graduation incident, Veronica's carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The whisper campaign I had initiated was working better than I had hoped. Chicago's elite social circles are smaller and more interconnected than most people realize, and once doubt begins to spread about someone's authenticity, it becomes nearly impossible to contain. Veronica found herself suddenly unwelcome at events she had been attending for months. Gallery openings where she had positioned herself as an expert suddenly had no room for her on the guest lists. Charity committees, where she had been volunteering mysteriously, no longer needed her services. The art world, in particular, had turned against her. Word had spread that her credentials were questionable, and in a field where reputation is everything, she found herself persona non grata at the venues where she had been building her credibility. But it was the financial pressure that really began to show. Richard's business partners had become concerned enough about his judgment to restrict his access to certain accounts. Clients who had been considering major investments began asking pointed questions about his stability. Several deals that should have been routine began falling through. Most significantly, Richard's law firm held an emergency partners meeting where they discussed his personal situation and its potential impact on the firm's reputation. While they couldn't fire him outright, they could, and did, restrict his role in client relations and limit his access to firm resources. The financial squeeze was working exactly as I had hoped. Veronica, accustomed to a steady flow of money from her marks, found herself in an unfamiliar position. Richard's income was being restricted just as her own access to Chicago's wealthy social scene was being cut off. For the first time in her criminal career, she was running out of options while still in the middle of a con. I watched from my comfortable distance as she began to show signs of strain. Her expensive clothes became slightly less perfectly maintained. Her confidence in social situations began to waver. Most tellingly, she began pushing Richard harder for financial commitments. According to James Crawford, who was still monitoring their activities, Veronica had been pressuring Richard to liquidate more assets and transfer them to her control. She claimed it was for investment opportunities and tax advantages, but her desperation was becoming obvious. Richard, finally beginning to understand the scope of his situation, was starting to resist. Their fights became more frequent and more public. The Union League Club incident was followed by a scene at Gibson's, another at the Chicago Theater, and a particularly ugly confrontation at Navy Pier that was witnessed by several people who knew them. Veronica's mask was slipping, and the calculating criminal beneath was beginning to show through. The final explosion came in October, exactly 5 months after that graduation lunch, and it was even more spectacular than I had hoped. James Crawford had been working with the FBI's white-collar crime unit, providing them with the evidence we had compiled on Veronica's previous cons. The Bureau had been building a case against her for months, following the trail of financial destruction she had left across 6 states. But it was a Chicago Tribune investigative reporter named Susan Martinez who broke the story that brought everything into the public eye. Susan had been tipped off about Veronica's background by someone in law enforcement, and she had spent weeks piecing together the full scope of Victoria Delacroix's criminal career. The article that ran on the front page of the Sunday Tribune was devastating in its thoroughness. The Chicago Con. How a professional grifter infiltrated high society, ran with photographs of Veronica at various social events, side by side with booking photos from her previous arrests. The article detailed her complete criminal history, interviewed several of her previous victims, and traced the money she had stolen over the past decade. But the most damaging element of the article was its focus on Richard and how completely he had been fooled. Susan Martinez had done her homework. She had documented every public appearance Richard and Veronica had made together, every financial transaction they could trace, and every warning sign that Richard had ignored. The article painted him not as a victim, but as a willfully blind fool who had been so desperate for validation that he had ignored obvious red flags. The business community's reaction was swift and brutal. Richard's law firm called an emergency partners meeting the Monday after the article ran. By Tuesday afternoon, he had been placed on indefinite administrative leave while they conducted their own investigation into his fitness to represent clients. His business investments, which had been struggling for months, completely collapsed as partners, and investors fled to avoid association with the scandal. The country club revoked both his membership and Veronica's pending application. Most humiliatingly, the Chicago Bar Association announced they would be conducting an ethics investigation into his behavior and judgment. Within a week of that Tribune article, Richard Vance had gone from a respected attorney and businessman to a public laughingstock. Veronica's reaction to the Tribune article was immediate and predictable. She disappeared. According to James Crawford's sources in law enforcement, she had already been planning her exit strategy for several weeks before the article ran. She had liquidated what assets she could access, withdrawn the cash Richard had given her, and prepared multiple escape routes. The FBI found her apartment empty, her car abandoned at O'Hare Airport, and her bank accounts drained. She had vanished as completely as she had after her previous cons, leaving behind nothing but a trail of destruction and a pile of forged documents. Richard was left to face the consequences alone. The financial damage was staggering. Between the money he had already given Veronica and the business losses resulting from the scandal, Richard had lost almost everything. His partnership in the law firm was effectively over. His real estate investments were failing. His reputation was beyond repair. But the psychological damage was even worse. Richard had built his entire identity around being successful, respected, and in control. To discover that he had been systematically manipulated and robbed by a criminal, and that his wife had known about it for months while he made a fool of himself, shattered his self-image completely. He began drinking heavily. He stopped maintaining his appearance. He withdrew from all social contact and spent his days in the small apartment he had rented after moving out of our family home. Michael, who had initially been angry with me for my handling of the graduation revelation, began to understand the full scope of what had happened. He reached out to his father repeatedly, trying to offer support, but Richard was too consumed by shame and self-pity to accept help. He brought this on himself. I told Michael during one of our weekly dinners. I didn't make him have an affair. I didn't make him ignore the warning signs. I didn't make him humiliate me publicly at your graduation. All I did was make sure he understood exactly what kind of person he was choosing over his family. Michael was struggling with divided loyalties, but he was also beginning to see the strength and intelligence his mother had shown throughout the crisis. "How long did you know?" he asked me one evening. "About the affair?" "Almost a year." "About what she really was?" "About 6 months." "Why didn't you warn him?" I considered the question carefully. Would he have listened? Or would he have accused me of lying in jealousy? Would he have believed me? Or would he have chosen to believe her? Michael was quiet for a long moment. He would have chosen her. Yes, he would have. Some lessons can only be learned through experience. Michael's evolution throughout this crisis was perhaps the most important outcome of the entire ordeal. At first, he had been angry with me for my timing and what he saw as my cruelty. But as the full truth emerged, he began to understand the impossible position I had been in. "You could have handled it privately," he said during one of our many conversations about the situation. "You could have confronted Dad without making it public." I agreed. And he would have denied it, or convinced me to keep quiet about it, or found some way to make me complicit in covering up what she was. The public revelation wasn't about hurting your father, Michael. It was about protecting myself and making sure the truth couldn't be buried or manipulated. It took time, but Michael eventually came to admire what I had done. He saw how I had handled the investigation with professionalism and thoroughness. He saw how I had protected our family's assets while his father was busy transferring them to a criminal. He saw how I had maintained my dignity and composure, even in the face of public humiliation. Most importantly, he saw that I had been protecting him too. "She would have taken everything," he said one day, finally understanding the full scope of Veronica's plan. "The house, the business, Dad's retirement accounts, even the money you and Dad had set aside for my future kids' education." That was her plan, yes. Professional criminals like Victoria are very thorough. They don't just take what's available, they position themselves to take everything. Michael began spending more time with me, valuing our conversations in ways he never had before. He saw his mother not as the quiet, supportive wife she had always been, but as a strong, intelligent woman who had outmaneuvered a professional criminal and protected her family. He also began to understand the price I had paid for 30 years of marriage to a man who was capable of such casual cruelty. The graduation announcement wasn't just about the divorce, he realized. It was about humiliating you as publicly as possible. "Your father wanted me to be devastated and helpless," I confirmed. "He wanted me to be the abandoned older wife who would quietly accept whatever scraps he chose to throw me. He never imagined I might have prepared for this possibility." The strength Michael saw in me during this period became the foundation for a much deeper and more genuine relationship between us. For the first time in his adult life, he began to really see me as a person rather than just as his mother. The confrontation I had been expecting finally came on a cold December evening, 8 months after the graduation incident. Richard appeared at my door unannounced, looking like a shadow of the confident man who had destroyed our marriage so publicly. He had lost weight, his expensive clothes hung loose on his frame, and his eyes had the desperate look of someone who had lost everything. I almost didn't let him in. Part of me wanted to close the door and let him stand there in the cold, the way he had left me to stand alone in that restaurant. But I was curious to hear what he would say, how he would try to justify what he had done. He looked terrible. The drinking was obvious in his bloated face and shaking hands. His usually perfect hair was unwashed and unkempt. His clothes, while still expensive, were wrinkled and stained. "Patricia," he began as soon as I opened the door. "We need to talk." "About what?" I kept my voice neutral, studying his face for any sign of genuine remorse. "About ending this," he said desperately. "About making it stop. About finding some way to fix what's happened." I led him into the living room, curious to see what form his plea would take. "I know I made mistakes," he continued, sitting heavily on the sofa where we had shared 30 years of conversations. "I know I hurt you. I know I was a fool. But what you've done to me, what you've cost me, it's gone too far." "What I've done to you?" I remained standing, looking down at this man I no longer recognized. "What exactly have I done to you, Richard? You destroyed my career. You ruined my reputation. You cost me everything I worked for." I studied his face, looking for any sign that he understood what had really happened. I saw nothing but self-pity and blame. "I gave you an envelope containing true information about a criminal who was robbing you blind," I said calmly. "Everything that happened after that was the natural consequence of the choices you made. You could have warned me privately. You could have." "I could have done many things," I interrupted. "Just as you could have chosen not to have an affair. You could have chosen not to humiliate me publicly at our son's graduation. You could have chosen not to transfer our family's assets to a criminal. But you didn't. You made your choices, and now you're living with the consequences." Richard's desperation was palpable. "Patricia, please. I'm begging you. Help me fix this. Tell people you made a mistake. Tell them the information was wrong. Help me rebuild." I looked at this man who had shared my bed for 30 years, who had fathered my child, who had promised to love and honor me until death. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "No," I said simply. "I'll do anything. I'll give you whatever you want in the divorce. Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his desperate babbling. "You seem to think this is a negotiation. It's not. You made your choice when you decided to leave me for a criminal. You made your choice when you chose to humiliate me publicly. You made your choice when you decided that 30 years of marriage meant nothing to you. Now live with those choices. You can't just destroy a person's entire life over a mistake." "A mistake." I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. Having an affair might be a mistake. Falling for a con artist might be a mistake. But standing up in front of our friends and family to announce that you were leaving me for another woman? That wasn't a mistake, Richard. That was deliberate cruelty. The silence hung between us like a judgment. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "Nothing," I replied. "I want absolutely nothing from you. I want you to leave my house, and I want you to never contact me again unless it's through lawyers about the divorce. You chose your path when you decided I was disposable. Now walk it alone." Richard left that night, and I never saw him again. 2 years after that December confrontation, I sold the house where Richard and I had lived for 23 years and bought a small cottage in Door County, Wisconsin. The cottage sits on 3 acres overlooking Green Bay, with a view that changes with the seasons and a garden where I grow my own vegetables. The move was deliberate and carefully planned. I wanted distance from Chicago, from the social circles where the scandal had played out, from the memories of a marriage that had ended so badly. I wanted simplicity, peace, and the chance to discover who Patricia Peterson was when she wasn't defined by her relationship to someone else. The cottage is nothing like the suburban mansion Richard and I had shared. It's a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and a stone fireplace that I use on cold winter nights. The kitchen is small but efficient, with windows that look out over the bay. The master bedroom has a reading nook where I drink my morning coffee and watch the sunrise. I live quietly now and by choice. The people in Door County know me as Pat, the friendly widow who volunteers at the animal shelter and makes excellent apple pies for the church bake sales. They don't know about my previous life, my marriage, or the scandal that drove me here. I am simply a woman who chose to start over in a place where the past doesn't matter. My days follow a peaceful routine that would have seemed impossibly simple during my married years. I wake early and walk along the shoreline with Lucy, the golden retriever I adopted from the local shelter. I tend my garden, read books I never had time for when I was playing the role of corporate wife, and cook simple meals that please only me. Michael visits every few months, and our relationship has deepened in ways I never expected. He sees his mother differently now, not as the woman who destroyed his father, but as the woman who refused to be destroyed by his father. He has learned to value my intelligence, my strength, and my refusal to be anyone other than exactly who I am. "Are you happy?" he asked me during his last visit, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset over the water. "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy in a way I didn't know was possible." "Do you ever regret how you handled things with Dad?" I considered the question, as I have many times over the past 2 years. "I regret that your father chose to end our marriage the way he did. I regret that you had to witness that kind of cruelty. But I don't regret protecting myself, and I don't regret making sure the truth came out." What about forgiveness? What about it? Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse or pretending that cruel actions don't have consequences. Your father made choices that revealed exactly who he was when his character was tested. I chose to believe him. The peace I feel in this small cottage, in this quiet life, is profound in ways I struggle to articulate. For 30 years, I defined myself through my relationship to Richard, as his wife, his supporter, his social partner. I measured my worth by how well I maintained his comfort and his image. Now I answer only to myself. I wake up when I want to wake up. I eat what I want to eat. I read books that interest me, watch movies that make me laugh, and spend my time exactly as I choose to spend it. I have genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. The money from the divorce settlement, which was considerable since Richard's infidelity and poor judgment worked heavily in my favor, sits safely invested in accounts that will ensure I never have to depend on anyone else for my security. I don't live extravagantly, but I live comfortably, and I sleep well at night knowing that my future is my own. 3 years have passed since Richard stood up at that graduation lunch and destroyed our marriage so publicly. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, watching the boats come in from their day on the bay, I think about that moment and how completely it changed the trajectory of both our lives. Richard, according to Michael's occasional updates, never recovered from the scandal. He lost his law license permanently after the ethics investigation concluded that his judgment had been compromised beyond repair. His business investments collapsed completely, and he declared bankruptcy within a year of Veronica's disappearance. He lives now in a one-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Milwaukee, working as a paralegal for a small firm that specializes in workers' compensation claims. He drinks too much, has no social life to speak of, and has never attempted to date anyone since Veronica vanished with his money and his reputation. Michael feels sorry for him, and I understand that. Richard is still his father, and watching a parent's complete destruction is painful regardless of the circumstances that led to it. But I feel no pity for the man who chose to humiliate me so publicly and then blame me for the consequences of his own choices. Veronica was never caught, as far as anyone knows. The FBI's investigation went cold when she disappeared, and she has presumably reinvented herself in another city with another identity, targeting another wealthy Mark who believes himself too smart to be fooled by a beautiful woman. The justice I achieved wasn't the dramatic kind you see in movies. There were no courtroom confrontations, no tearful reconciliations, no moments of public vindication. Instead, I chose the quieter path of simply stepping back and allowing natural consequences to play out. Richard wanted a new life with a younger woman. I made sure he got exactly what he chose, a life with the kind of person who would abandon him the moment his money ran out and his usefulness ended. The money he lost to Veronica was considerable, but it was nothing compared to what he lost when his character was revealed so publicly. A reputation built over 30 years can be destroyed in a single news cycle, and Richard learned that lesson thoroughly. The most profound justice, though, is simply this: I am free. For 30 years, I carried the burden of loving someone who is capable of casual cruelty. I made excuses for his selfishness, covered for his shortcomings, and enabled his ego at the expense of my own identity. I believed that was what marriage meant: sacrifice, compromise, and endless forgiveness. Now I know better. Marriage should be a partnership between equals who choose each other every day, not a prison where one person sacrifices their dignity to maintain the other person's comfort. The woman who sat in that restaurant and listened to her husband announce his divorce is a stranger to me now. She was someone who measured her worth by how well she served others, who believed that love meant accepting whatever treatment she received, who thought that keeping peace was more important than keeping her self-respect. I am not that woman anymore. I am someone who understands that dignity is not negotiable, that respect must be mutual, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. Richard wanted me to be devastated by his abandonment. He wanted me to be the tragic figure of the older woman discarded for a younger model. He wanted me to beg, to plead, to make his choice seem important and difficult. Instead, I handed him an envelope that revealed the truth about his new beginning, and then walked away to build a life that was entirely my own. The cottage in Door County has taught me things about myself that I never knew during my married years. I am an excellent gardener, with a particular talent for growing tomatoes and herbs. I make a mean apple pie from scratch. I can fix a leaky faucet, paint a room, and stack firewood. I enjoy reading mystery novels and watching old movies. I prefer quiet evenings to social events, and I've discovered that I actually like my own company. Most importantly, I've learned that I don't need anyone else's approval or validation to feel complete. The friends I've made in Door County are genuine friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect, not social obligation or business networking. They know me as Pat, the woman who brings homemade cookies to the library fundraiser and never misses a community theater production. They don't know about my previous life, and they don't need to. Michael brings his girlfriend to visit sometimes, and I see in their relationship what a healthy partnership looks like. They support each other's dreams, respect each other's boundaries, and choose to be together because they genuinely enjoy each other's company. They argue sometimes, but they argue fairly, without cruelty or deliberate humiliation. Your dad and I never had what you and Sarah have, I told Michael during their last visit. I thought what we had was normal, but watching you two together has shown me what I was missing. What do you mean? Kindness, I said simply. Basic human kindness. Your father was never deliberately cruel until the end, but he was never particularly kind either. Everything was about his comfort, his needs, his reputation. I spent 30 years making myself smaller, so he could feel bigger. Michael was quiet for a moment. I don't want to end up like him. You won't, I assured him. You already show Sarah more consideration in a day than your father showed me in a year. You learned different lessons. The peace I've found here is not the peace of resignation or defeat. It's the peace of knowing exactly who I am and being completely comfortable with that person. I wake up every morning grateful for the simple pleasures of my quiet life. The sound of waves outside my window, the smell of coffee brewing, the sight of my garden in bloom. I don't miss the social obligations of my previous life, the endless charity events and business dinners where I smiled and made small talk while feeling invisible. I don't miss the constant worry about Richard's moods or the exhausting work of managing his ego and reputation. I certainly don't miss lying awake at night wondering if my husband was losing interest in me, or if I was getting too old, or if I was somehow failing as a wife because he seemed increasingly distant and critical. Those worries belong to a different woman, living a different life. The woman I am now sleeps peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she chose herself when it mattered most. She chose dignity over desperation, truth over illusion, freedom over the familiar cage of a loveless marriage. Richard got exactly what he asked for, a new life without me. The fact that his new life turned out to be a disaster was entirely his own doing. I simply made sure he understood exactly what he was choosing. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the bay is calm and the sunset is particularly beautiful, I think about the envelope I handed him that day. It contained nothing but truth, documented, verified, undeniable truth about the kind of person he was choosing over his family. The truth is not cruel, even when it's devastating. The truth is simply the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most powerful weapon you can wield. I am Patricia Peterson, and I am 58 years old. I live in a cottage by the water where I grow my own vegetables and make my own choices. I answer to no one but myself, and I sleep well at night knowing that when my character was tested, I chose wisely. I chose truth over lies, dignity over desperation, and freedom over the false security of a marriage that had become a prison. This is my quiet victory. This is my peace. And this is my new beginning, the one I chose for myself, on my own terms, with my eyes wide open and my conscience clear. The woman who was abandoned at that graduation lunch is gone forever. In her place stands someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more free. Someone who learned that the best revenge is living well, and that the deepest justice comes not from destroying your enemies, but from refusing to let them destroy you. And that, my friends, is the power of a woman who was publicly humiliated but found her strength, her dignity, and her ultimate freedom in the most unexpected way. Patricia's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in dramatic confrontations or elaborate schemes of revenge. It's in the quiet choice to value yourself enough to walk away from toxicity and build a life of genuine peace and contentment. Her story shows us that dignity is not negotiable, that truth is the most powerful weapon we have, and that sometimes the best way to win is simply to refuse to play someone else's game. If Patricia's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of choosing your own happiness over others' expectations, then hit that subscribe button, join the Her True Stories family, and let's continue to share these incredible tales of quiet strength and profound courage together. Until next time, stay strong, stay true to yourself, and remember, your peace is worth protecting.